It's widely known how Game Freak has nerfed various Pokemon over the years. In the case of Pokemon like Zacian or Talonflame, you can usually point to a singular strong tool that was taken away from them to make them more fair to play against. But when Game Freak makes the rare decision to nerf a move into the ground, it has widespread consequences across the entire game. So good morning everybody, good morning, it's JPR, well, the fake me at least, I'm away for the holidays, and today we're going through the generations to find the moves that Pokemon has nerfed the most. Let's start by getting the obvious out of the way. Perhaps the most nerfed move of all time, Hyper Beam. Hyper Beam was just one of many reasons why Gen 1 normal types were as broken as they were. Most Gen 1 normal types were fast, had crazy large move pools, were only resisted by the rock type, which wasn't all that great back then, and Gengar was the only relevant ghost type immune to them. But I guess that's what happens when you decide to have an entire type only be represented by a single family. But arguably the biggest weapon in most Gen 1 normal types arsenals, heck, any offensive Pokemon's arsenal, was Hyper Beam. Hyper Beam is a 150 base power attack that is teachable to almost any fully evolved Pokemon. Pretty much it was envisioned as any Pokemon's greatest trump card. Normally it's balanced by the fact that it has to recharge after using it, but in Generation 1 the move had an extra bonus effect. It didn't have to recharge if you successfully knocked a Pokemon out using the move. Or also if you broke a substitute, so yeah, substitute kinda sucked in Gen 1. My guess is that this definitely wasn't intended, as in Pokemon Stadium, Hyper Beam makes the user recharge no matter what. But, you know, Gen 1 coding is held together by duct tape in a dream, so I guess it shouldn't be too surprising. But without having to recharge if you KO'd the opponent, this meant that powerful normal-type Pokemon like Snorlax and Tauros could almost fire off a Hyper Beam risk-free, as there was a high chance that you could KO whatever was on the field with it. Oh, and of course, since critical hits in Gen 1 are based off of speed, another one of Tauros and Persian's highest stats, critical hit Hyper Beams were also fairly common to see. Of course, these Pokemon were also helped out by the old physical special split mechanics, where all normal type moves were physical, so in a weird way, Hyper Beam used to be Giga Impact before there was a reason for Giga Impact to exist in Gen 4. Pokemon is strange like that. But after the move was properly fixed in Gen 2, Hyper Beam became far riskier of a move to go for. Some Pokemon like Belly Drum Charizard would use it to one-hit KO the many bulky threats that Gen 2 is infamous for, like Snorlax and Snorlax and Snorlax. But for the most part, Hyper Beam was far from the threat it used to be. As the years went on, only a select few Pokemon were able to take advantage of Hyper Beam's destructive capabilities. The only gens where Hyper Beam even got remotely close to being relevant again was in Gens 7 and 8, where Hyper Beam could be turned into an extra powerful Z move or Max move while avoiding the need to recharge. But even then, Giga Impact was usually the move of choice for the basis of these gimmicks, not Hyper Beam. And without a way to transform Hyper Beam into a different attack with Gen 9's gimmick, Hyper Beam has once again fallen into the pits of obscurity. So much so that many argue that Hyper Beam is perhaps the most nerfed attack in Pokemon history, going from an absolute staple in Gen 1 to hardly ever used at all in modern generations. And honestly, that's probably true. Although I would argue that trapping moves like Fire Spin, Clamp, and Wrap are up there, which were horribly unbalanced in Gen 1. As long as you were faster than your opponent and didn't miss, you could infinitely restrain your opponent with these moves. And they would never be able to attack or switch. It was genuinely awful. It was so broken to the point where Dragonite would sometimes run Wrap instead of Hyper Beam. But while this next move hasn't been nerfed as heavily as Hyper Beam or Wrap, it has been nerfed more times than practically anything, and that move is Blizzard, with it receiving 3 direct nerfs at different points in history. Dairy Queen is not gonna be happy to hear this. The first nerf happened in Gen 1. Yes, in the middle of Gen 1. You know how crazy a move has to be to get nerfed in the middle of a generation? Especially the first one where so much other stuff needed fixing? In the Japanese versions of Gen 1's core games, Red, Green, and Blue, Blizzard had a 30% chance to freeze the opponent. That's like the same chance Scald has to burn somebody, but this is freeze! Arguably the most unbalanced mechanic in the entire game. You might be thinking, well, golly gee, that doesn't sound so bad since Blizzard only has 70% accuracy, except in Gen 1, it also had 90% accuracy. So, recognizing that this might be just a tad bit silly, Game Freak actually adjusted the code of the international copies of Red and Blue, lowering Blizzard's freeze chance to the 10% we have always kept since. That didn't stop Blizzard from still being one of the most broken moves in Gen 1, but imagine how much worse things could have been if that 30% chance stayed the same. It wouldn't be until Gen 2 where Blizzard's absurd 90% accuracy was lowered to a far more reasonable 70%. But aside from direct nerfs, Gen 2 also introduced some indirect nerfs to Blizzard, including the fact that Ice-type attacks were no longer neutral against Fire types, and the newly introduced Steel-type was yet another resistance to worry about. If it seems like Pokemon absolutely hates Ice, that's because they do. But Blizzard would at least receive some reparations in Gen 3, where Blizzard received the bonus effect where it can never miss in a hailstorm. And this would prove to be Blizzard's saving grace, as it's still an incredibly popular move today in teams that utilize the snow weather condition. And this is despite a third nerf in Gen 6 where Blizzard was lowered from 120 base power to 110. A pretty small nerf, all things considered, and not too surprising of one, as Game Freak also nerfed powerful moves like Thunder and Fire Blast this gen in an effort to make defensive Pokemon more viable. I would say that despite receiving 3 different nerfs though, Blizzard came out smelling like a rose. It certainly hasn't completely disappeared from the meta like Hyper Beam has, although it is significantly less common in single battles. And, well, as much as losing 10 base power sucks, could you imagine losing 250 base power? Yeah, that might sound absolutely ludicrous, but it's kinda what happened to Explosion back in Gen 5. See, in Gen 1, Explosion was only 170 power, not the 250 we know it by today. But it also had a hidden bonus effect that I'm fairly certain the game never tells you about. That being that it actually cuts the opponent's defense stat in half, effectively doubling the power of this move. So instead of 170, it had like the power of 340. And when the move was buffed to 250 power in Gen 2, the actual effect was more like buffing it to 500 base power. This pretty much guaranteed that Explosion would annihilate anything on the field aside from Ghost types. Even Rock and Steel types weren't safe from this move's ferocious power. But as mentioned before, starting in Gen 5, Explosion lost this hidden effect. So its base power really is just 250 now, meaning that it is far easier to survive an explosion than in years past, making the move far less useful than it once was. While some Pokemon like Mega Glalie were still able to use Explosion to some effect, overall this came as a huge nerf to previously popular users like Exeggutor, Azelf, Bronzong, and Metagross, who relied on Explosion to secure big KOs when it mattered most. Don't ask me why Azelf can learn it, I guess because it takes a lot of willpower to run into battle and blow yourself up. Yep, seems like a sound explanation. Anyway, for anyone feeling lost in the sauce of competitive lingo, let's stop to do a funny one real quick that has never really been competitively viable, but definitely took a big hit. And that move is Dig. In Gen 1, Dig actually had 100 base power, which is crazy to think about. It literally had the same power as Earthquake. But for some reason, Dig took a massive hit in base power in Gen 2, tumbling all the way to 60. I don't know what Gen 2 had against powerful moves, but this one seemed especially odd given that nobody is really winning with Dig against a real person. Maybe it's because Dig is meant to be an early game attack, so having access to something with 100 base power so early in the game could be a balance issue. I mean, in Gen 1 you get it immediately after defeating Misty, and in Gen 2 it's in National Park just after Whitney, so yeah, maybe 60 base power seemed more appropriate for this point in the game. Dig would return to a much more reasonable base power of 80 in Gen 4 where it has stayed ever since, but yeah, just the fact that it went from 100 all the way to 60 has always seemed funny to me. Who knows, if it was still 100, maybe it could be a somewhat decent VGC alternative to Earthquake? Well, probably not. You do take double damage from Earthquake when you use Dig, so I guess multi-turn attacks are always destined to just be bad. Some moves have been nerfed in ways aside from just raw characteristics though. Take for instance 2 very popular competitive moves, Scald and Toxic. In Gen 9, Scald saw a massive distribution nerf. In Gen 8, this highly valuable water-type attack with a very generous burn chance that you would see on almost any good competitive team could be taught to roughly 17% of all Pokemon in the game. But when Scarlet and Violet first released, Scald was all but taken out of the game, as it initially lost its status as a TM, and the only Pokemon available in the game that could learn it by leveling up was Volcanion, who already had the much better version of Scald with Steam Eruption. So yeah, for nearly an entire year, Scald was completely dead. It did eventually return in the DLC as TM-188, but now it's only teachable to 25 Pokemon in the game, and not just every water type in existence, a decline of nearly 80%. That's almost as bad as my bank account this Christmas. Pretty much almost exactly 100 Pokemon lost the ability to boil their own water, except for some funny ones like Raikou, Emboar, Colossal, and Sinistcha. The funny thing is though, this actually served as a massive buff to the Pokemon who actually got to keep Scald like Alomomola and Slowking, who were suddenly in much higher demand due to the low amount of competitors in the Scald market. As for the other aforementioned move, Toxic, it was previously one of the few TMs that could be taught to virtually any Pokemon in existence, minus the ones that can't use TMs like Caterpie, Magikarp, and very oddly, Magearna, and funnily enough there might actually be a lore reason behind this. The reason why almost any Pokemon could learn Toxic in the past is because it's actually a technique developed by ninjas 400 years ago, not a natural move. But Magearna was a Pokemon designed 500 years ago, meaning it was designed with the capability to use Toxic. It and Tynamo, who only gets access to a very limited number of TMs, are actually the only Pokemon that can use TMs who can't learn Toxic in any way. But anyhow, Toxic was removed as a TM in Sword and Shield, but transferable Pokemon that knew Toxic in the past could still use it, so it wasn't a massive nerf. But starting in Gen 9, Toxic would be deleted from any Pokemon's moveset who is transferred up from a past generation, lowering the percentage of Pokemon who could learn Toxic from 90% all the way to 13%. I hesitate to call this one of the most nerfed moves ever though, because Toxic actually got significantly buffed in Gen 6, where now it never misses if used by a Poison-type Pokemon. And pretty much almost all the Pokemon who kept Toxic in Gen 9 are Poison types. And like Scald, it actually increases the value of the few who kept it, like Clodsire and Toxapex. You can tell Game Freak really started to hate stall gameplay in Gen 9 though, because not only did Toxic receive a huge distribution nerf, but also all recovery moves were substantially nerfed to only have 5 PP, including Recover, Soft Boiled, Milk Drink, Slack Off, and even Rest, which puts you to sleep. Honestly, this feels like a good balance change though. It means that walls don't have unlimited HP anymore and they actually have to ration their healing options. I think it makes the game more strategic for all involved. This actually reminds me of another stall nerf that happened all the way back in Generation 3, the Sleep Talk nerf. Back in Gen 2 when Sleep Talk was introduced, they had way less restrictions on it than it does now. And one of those things was that Sleep Talk could actually activate Rest to restore the user's HP even when it was already asleep. Obviously, this is one of the biggest reasons why Gen 2 has one of the most stall-oriented metas of any generation, and why Gen 2 Snorlax was one of the most dominant competitive Pokemon of all time. But starting in Gen 3, Sleep Talk could no longer summon Rest, which led to a huge downfall in the move's competitive viability. Although in Gen 4, Sleep Talk did gain the ability to summon moves that already had 0 PP remaining. This didn't mean much until Gen 9 though, where Palmont and Rabsca are able to get way more usage out of Revival Blessing, which normally only has 1 PP. It's a pretty cheesy set, but it can work. Continuing with earlier history, 2 moves were massively nerfed in the transition from Gen 5 to Gen 6, and those moves were Draco Meteor and Outrage. While Draco Meteor did receive a direct nerf going from 140 base power to 130, the most consequential nerfs done to these 2 attacks were very indirect. First and foremost, obviously the introduction of fairy types. This meant that people were way less likely to lock into Outrage after Dragon Dancing to pick up a few incredibly easy KOs, because if you use Outrage on a fairy type, you just skip to being confused. So now people usually opt to run the much less committed but much less powerful Dragon Claw. As for Draco Meteor, it not only suffers from fairies existing, but also the loss of Dragon Gem. Of the 18 elemental gems, well, I guess 17 since Fairy Gem was never made obtainable, Dragon Gem was by far the most devastating, as it would increase the power of Draco Meteor from 140 to 210. It was pretty much a Z move before its time. And back in Gen 5, with only Steel types resisting Dragon and nothing being immune to it, you could pretty much drop a Dragon Gem boosted Draco Meteor onto anything for an easy KO. And for the last move of the video, could it be anything other than our pride and joy, Dark Void? I don't even really feel the need to explain this one. I feel like I have in 4 separate videos already, maybe even 5. But hey, Darkrai's signature move was shamelessly abused by Smeargle and VGC for years. Game Freak felt the need to nerf it to 50% accuracy, except this nerf was totally unneeded because Game Freak also changed the properties of Smeargle's sketch so that Dark Void can't be copied anymore. So now, Darkrai, who isn't even legal in VGC, has to deal with the consequences of somebody else's actions. Whee! It's literally less accurate than Hypnosis. Can we at least get this bumped up to 60% accuracy in Gen 10? Dang it, Game Freak, what are y'all doing? But that is the history of some Pokemon's most nerfed attacks. Which one do you think was the most severe? Let me know in the comment section down below. But don't forget to leave a like on this video, subscribe for more videos like this one, and I'll see you guys next time.